Thank you very much for the invitation, especially since this became an occasion for me to work out something that's been sort of simmering at the back of my mind that has a lot to do with forcing myself to think about my own methodology. I guess I started also thinking about this when I got asked to provide 3 sort of social media tidbits. I don't know where they went, but I produced them nonetheless. And one of them, I think, was how would I define critical theory to a small child? And I think at that point I gave a rather sort of standard answer. Critical theory engages you with the thinking of how thinking gets set into practice, etc., etc. But that did get me also thinking about how exactly that kind of modus operandi of critical theory does get translated in sort of an academic setting. In particular, since the field I work mostly on, Walter Benjamin, is in fact a very contentious field. I was just having a conversation with Josh on my way here about basically the continental drifts that are at work in the field of Benjamin studies. And I guess the paper I am going to present today is a way for me to work out some of like what would come closest to a sort of statement of methodology, which is very much informed by the way I've approached Benjamin as an interlocutor with ideas from German idealism, as was mentioned in the history and philosophy of mathematics in particular, and how they all relate to the theory of history that one is very familiar with, or maybe defamiliarized as a result in Benjamin. So I'm sort of a critical theorist who works a lot in the archives. So I'm this weird hybrid of an theorist archivist who, and a lot of the stuff I have done has been to really take a look at the material, apocryphal and otherwise, situated in places like Jerusalem, in the PDF versions of the Benjamin Archive in Berlin, all of which really, once you get into that aspect of critical theory, really, that is to say, a philological approach to critical theory, start to unsettle certain of the givens about what a text is and what a theoretical text is and can do. Is it merely another form of thought that is commodifiable, packageable by any given publisher, teachable to students in sort of, page limit friendly sort of packets? Are you going to let a publisher like Rousseau, for instance, dictate exactly how you see the beginning and the end of a thought? So a lot of what I do is unpick that, basically because I've seen it firsthand. Right? I see how much contention there is in the letters, in the publication history, and also in really those deeply biographical circumstances of how these texts arose. And what I'm going to present today is one of these projects that actually never made it into the daylight, if you will. It's part of one of 3 book ideas that I have in my head. I'm sort of working out which one to go for first. This, in fact, again, really thankful that I had this opportunity to work it out here. This, in fact, is my first attempt at this particular book idea, which is essentially trying to write about Benjamin's unfinished or unrealized projects. I'm not entirely satisfied yet because it's a lot easier to write in a positivistic mode that, about anything really, that sort of it's much more difficult to sort of avoid a reconstructive impulse in trying to reconstrue something like the unwritten. So anyway, here goes. This is my first attempt at this, and you can tell me how awfully wrong I've gone, at the end of this. So it's in 3 parts. The first part is going to walk through some of the historical detail, and then afterwards we'll get very nicely critical theory, like you expect me to be. Okay, small history of sincerity, into quotation marks, Rousseau, Gide, and Benjamin. Part 1, somber hours. In 1939, days after Germany's invasion of Poland on September 1st, Germans and Austrians of military age were rounded up and sequestered in the Stade de Colum, Paris's Olympic arena. 10 days later, detainees were formed into groups and sent to so-called camps for voluntary workers around the country, including one to the abandoned Château de Venouche, located near Nevers. Among this group of 300 was Walter Benjamin, who at the age of 47 was one of the oldest and, according to eyewitness reports, evidently suffering from the combination of ill health and the harsh conditions he now found himself in. For a while it appeared that only the spirit of beneficial camaraderie reigning amongst the diverse camp inhabitants was able to lift his mood somewhat during the somber hours of awaiting their collective fate with uncertainty. Moreover, Benjamin only had very restricted access to communications with the outside world during this period, and with each inmate limited to just 2 letters a week, most, including Benjamin, used them primarily for requests for basic necessities for survival. Benjamin, however, made 2 exceptions to this rule. First, he repeatedly wrote to his various friends asking initially for proofs of his essay on some motifs in Baudelaire, which he had submitted on August 1st to the Journal of Horkheimer's Institute for Social Research. After hearing nothing, he eventually started asking for the print version, which, as he lamented to the writer Bernard von Brentano, unfortunately had to go to press before I had a chance to read or correct the proofs. Certainly, the existential anxieties Benjamin seems to have attached to the fate of his Baudelaire essay were not unfounded. Benjamin's material existence had grown altogether dependent on the support he could muster from the Institute for Social Research, which paid him his sole livelihood in return for his research and intermittent reports on the state of literary politics on the continent. Horkheimer Adorno, by this time obviously in New York, right, safe if you're in New York, had been very forthcoming with their criticisms of an earlier version submitted in October 1938, entitled The Paris of the Second Empire in Baudelaire. Adorno, in particular, felt secure enough that his erstwhile mentor was so entirely dependent on his support at the Institute that he was at liberty to question the viability of the essay's constructive principle, a deliberately fragmentary approach Benjamin had developed during his latest phase of working on the Arcades project. For Adorno, the essay suffered from what he regarded as a lack of mediation in the secret affinities that Benjamin sought to establish between features of industrial capitalism and corresponding features in Baudelaire's poetry. In response, Benjamin defended his newfound structural approach as a means to interrogate precisely the antagonism between the Institute's dialectical materialism and his own personal production interests. Subsequent revisions at Adorno's behest seem to have been made with the aim of pacifying the Institute while preserving the essay's key positions. Benjamin's exhortations from the internment camp that his friends keep him abreast of the status of his revisions betray, if nothing else, the anxiety that the Institute may yet interfere with unauthorized changes, coupled with the additional worry that the Institute should discover that the revised essay in fact conformed to its expectations in order to secure a material existence by deflecting from its actual intent, namely, to describe Baudelaire's poetry as registering the problem of historical consciousness rather than its dialectical solution. At the same time, Benjamin also requested reading material during his time of internment. Friends who were instrumental in securing for him packages of cigarettes and chocolate, which are valuable currency in the camps, were also asked to send him copies of Rousseau's Confessions, as well as Cardinal Retz's Memoirs. This fact may have remained unremarkable had Benjamin not then sent a letter to Horkheimer on the 30th of November 1939, just 5 days after his release from the camp and return to Paris, to propose that he undertake a, quote, comparative study of Rousseau's Confessions and André Gide's Journal. He had read Rousseau's Confessions for the first time là-bas, that is at the camp at Nevers, and found it to constitute a rough sketch of a social character of which Gide's Journal would represent the decline. Such a comparison would serve somewhat more than the usual purpose of reporting on French literary politics for the colleagues in New York. Rather, the comparative study would, quote, furnish a sort of historical critique of sincerity, with this last word, sincerity, placed in quotation marks and never elaborated elsewhere. Not much more is known about the proposed project, except that in the same letter where Benjamin first mentions it, he also proposes an alternative, namely that the Institute sponsor him to undertake a continuation of the Baudelaire project, of which the recently published On Some Motifs in Baudelaire had only been the middle part. This published part, moreover, had not yet treated the most important and intractable problem he had envisioned for the Baudelaire book, which he soon announced to Horkheimer as an attempt to secure an aspect of history that has to establish an irremediable scission between our manner of seeing and the traces of positivism that, in my view, still profoundly mark the concepts of history that are closest and most familiar to us. The construction of such an attempt was, of course, the aim of some theses on the concept of history that he was just then developing. In fact, this letter was the first time he announces that he's been working on these theses. These served so well as the theoretical armature for the continuation of the book on Baudelaire that he says he now felt compelled to set the Rousseau-Gide study aside for the moment. The admission of such an ulterior motive nonetheless suggests that while worrying about the efficacy of his deflections of possible interferences in the Baudelaire project from New York, Benjamin also began considering Rousseau as a theoretical armature against a similar target, specifically remonstrations such as Adorno's that Benjamin's modus operandi presents to his reader an unmediated, amazed presentation of mere facticity, quotes. A charge that no doubt would have rang doubly ironically for Benjamin, who was a recently expatriated German Jew confined in an internment camp for potential enemies of the state. The, quote, subjectification of phantasmagoria, which Adorno found so problematic in Benjamin's assertion what he considered to be unmediated affinities between the pragmatic contents of Baudelaire on the one hand and the social historical traits of his time on the other, certainly runs the risk of, quote, not differentiating between magic and positivism. But for this non-differentiation to be liquidated, it is necessary, in Benjamin's view, to take amazement, Verwundern, itself as the object of investigation. In other words, to grasp as such the amazement that masquerades as the appearance of a contained facticity, and all appearances of facticity in turn as non-differentiation between magic and positivism, arising from the subjectification of phantasmagoria that has been construed as bourgeois interiority. Benjamin calls his procedure, this grasping of amazement, philology, as he describes it, a wide-eyed approach that involves focusing on one textual detail to the next, which leads the reader to fixate magically upon the text in order to capture and make investigable the appearance character of facticity in view of its historical constructedness and opacity in the present. Indeed, the appearance of facticity only disappears to the degree at which the object, that is, this amazement that issues into a non-distinction between simple nature and the historical present, to the degree at which this object is constructed from a historical perspective. It was in this context of insisting on a historical critical treatment of amazement as the exceptional object of dialectical insight, rather than something given that affords this insight in the first place, that Benjamin conceived of his comparative study of Rousseau and Gide, and its proposed critical history of sincerity in quotation marks. After all, if there was a writer who confessed to the partiality of his meaning, and therefore, unlike Baudelaire, could provide a conceptual counterpoint to the intoxicating non-differentiation between magic and positivism, this would be the Rousseau of the Confessions. Part 2. Why sincerity, or reading the unwritten? For, after all, it was also Kierkegaard who Adorno likely had in mind when he criticized Benjamin's treatment of the Parisian arcades as the flaneur's interior, and Kierkegaard, whose theory of the interior history of the mythic certainly provided the model for Adorno's understanding of Benjamin's concept of the dialectical image. According to Adorno, Kierkegaard regarded the intérieur as an image constituted from the unity of the Platonic dialectic and mythic. The complete immanence of thinking and its inner history produces images that are corporeally organized and jointly destroy the historical facticity and ontological truth of a soul in the visible mythic image. The dialectic that produces this natural image of organization, qua image of organized nature, is itself identified as mythic, however, and as the productivity of a second nature rather than of the mind's mediation, which Adorno points out with reference to Kierkegaard's sickness unto death. Quote, "One may arrive at a similar conclusion of the mythical by beginning with the image. When in an age of reflection one sees the image protrude ever so slightly and unobserved into a reflective representation, and, like an antediluvian fossil, suggest another species of existence washed away by doubts, one will perhaps be amazed that the image could ever have played such an important role." This amazement that Kierkegaard expresses at the primacy of the image, according to Adorno, is what announces the deepest insights into the relation of dialectic, myth, and image. Namely, that the image of nature at work in the dialectic is not living and continuous, but rather mythic and or historical. Quote, "Dialectic comes to a stop in the image and cites the mythical in the historically most recent as the distant past. For this reason, images like the interior, which bring dialectic and myth to the point of non-differentiation, are genuinely prehistorical. And in this sense, they, according to Adorno, they can be understood as, quote, dialectical images, to use Benjamin's expression." So this is from Adorno's Kierkegaard book. Now, back to 1939. In response to Adorno's interventions on the Baudelaire essay, Benjamin offers a correction of his own, namely that Adorno had, in fact, entirely misunderstood the expression that Benjamin had originated, namely the dialectical image. He says, "Amazement," you write in your Kierkegaard book, announces the deepest insight into the relation of dialectic, myth, and image. But I think it should actually read, "Amazement is an extraordinary object of such an insight." Amazement per se cannot provide the critical method for its own elimination. After all, the prehistorical mythic character of the interior is attributable to this image of organization in nature just as little as the invention of the bourgeois interior began with Kierkegaard rather than with Rousseau. Benjamin's remarks on Rousseau are scattered about and found in the Arcades project for the most part, but there does emerge from them an outline of a historical critique of the immediacy with which the claim to false immediacy is taken to collapse into a second true immediacy. For Kierkegaard, Rousseau was, before Kierkegaard, Rousseau was the producer of dialectical images. Quotes, "Some pages in Rousseau," this is Benjamin, secretly indicate a meaning that the contemporary reader would not have been able to decipher. They operate like photosensitive plates on which the past has deposited its images, but of whose future alone developing agents can access only if they are strong enough to allow all the details to emerge. The Rousseauvian image of unbroken, simple nature secretly indicated in this way the highest principle around which a new society might be organized, by pointing to the traces of its own future becoming in virtue of its present impossibility. Thus the Rousseau who appears as the childish dreamer of a perpetual peace, which Voltaire would savage for his optimism, is also, or in fact, the philological object par excellence. The writer of That Which Has Never Been Written, this is Benjamin glossing Hugo von Hofmannsthal in his definition of philology, which the reader would do well to bear in mind if he or she is to be a true historian. Before Kierkegaard, Rousseau revealed the partiality of the image of organized nature by confessing to the partiality of his own image of natural organization. The Confessions are indeed the place where the historical critical dimension of the dialectical image is introduced by way of its presentation of sincerity in quotation marks. For Benjamin's purposes, sincerity in quotation marks seems to have little to do with affirming the performative or even the proleptic character of political statements such as the promise, on which the social contract is modeled, presumably, with the idea that the ideal community constitutes itself on the very promise of the free development and expression of each of its individual members. This, in the vaguest sense possible, is the formula with which the social contract poses the problem of the free community of individuals as the promise of, quote, finding a form of association which will defend and protect with the whole common force the person and goods of each associate, and in which each, while united himself with all, may still obey himself alone and remain as free as before. Benjamin rather seems likely to have found affinity with those passages in the Confessions where each associate's accession to a general will might have encountered an obstacle in no other place than his or her own nature. In the famous passage about Marion and the purloined ribbon, Jean-Jacques, Rousseau, Jean-Jacques, confesses that the genuine motivation for his confession was not to narrate his offense against Marion. He stole the ribbon he meant to give to her, causing Marion to be falsely accused of the crime and dismissed from her employment. Rather, he narrates that which he claims, quote, never to have told anyone, by which he refers to what he calls his innermost feelings, the conveyance of remorse, of shame, of fear, even of a perverse fantasy of being admonished by Marion, which as a confession of feelings alone communicates sincerity, a sense of the truthfulness with which he holds his convictions. In the corresponding passage in the Reveries, where he re-narrates in the same episode, Jean-Jacques recalls the awful lie he confessed in the Confessions, claiming that he can swear now that he had told the lie out of a false shame of being revealed in public. For him, there is no categorical or hypothetical reason why we should not lie. We are not constantly obligated to tell the truth, and we cannot rely on usefulness or intention to gauge whether or not we should tell the truth or whether a lie is justified. According to Rousseau, rather, we can only rely on the heart, that is, a natural but ultimately inscrutable sense of knowing to do the right thing, a feeling of sincerity, because private interest, quote, is almost always in conflict with public interest. The confessor thus confesses not to the truth, but to lying in all sincerity. In a state where each associate accedes to a form of association voluntarily and is supposed to remain as free as before, claims to the knowability of human nature, which once undergirded the dream of an ideal community, begin to show the signs of a breakdown. What these dreams attached to nature's knowability break down into, however, is perhaps simply, and nothing short of, any organization for which reason may not rely on comparing what one says with the object of a logical judgment, but rather what one holds as true with the subject before conscience, namely, any and all of the civic and intellectual forms of association that might rely on what one admirer of Rousseau called professions of faith. In the concluding remark to his essay on the miscarriage of all philosophical trials and theodicy, Kant examines one of the organizational forms where, as he argues, reason can only test itself in the court of one's own conscience. The association of candidates in theology, who, according to a new edict introduced in 1790 by Friedrich Wilhelm II's new repressive minister of education, Wöhner, were required not only to demonstrate their knowledge of Christian doctrine, but also their adherence to it. Kant argues that such declarations of adherence are impossible, since in matters of faith, one can only hope to hold to the truthfulness of what one says. By contrast, pretending to hold anything as true that we are not conscious of holding as true is a hypocrisy and an impurity of the heart. For Kant, care in becoming conscious of belief or unbelief, which is to say sincerity in holding what one says as truthful or otherwise, is the minimal negative condition for a community, to the extent that even oaths taken before the final judge of the world may be advisable, if only to extort truthfulness, quote unquote, in spite of the lies that we regularly tell ourselves about our convictions. Moreover, Kant reads the story of Job, a man who asserts his innocence in the face of God's unconditional divine decision to take away his many previous blessings, as an authentic theodicy and as such as an allegorical expression of God's self-interpretation in nature. Job speaks as he thinks, and testifies to the wisdom and inscrutability of both purposive and counter-purposive sides of God's creation, in contrast to those friends of his who surmise that he must have been punished for some untold crime and thereby feign to pass judgment on a cause into which they have no insight. With this example of Job, Kant extends sincerity as a condition not just for a community of faith, but also for an underlying, albeit inscrutable, moral order that connects with all physical being, analogous to the amazement, perhaps, that Adorno and Benjamin saw issuing into a non-differentiation between simple nature and the historical present, as though, in fact, the whole history of the earth and of the human species ultimately relied on this single fragile thread, the confession of truthfulness or non-truthfulness that must accompany anything that we say to ourselves. Rousseau was, as Benjamin suggests, the preacher of nature and virtue who was himself unnatural and unvirtuous, and his sincerity about this paradox of his disposition and character pivoted the question of the vocation of humankind towards an intractable entanglement of physical theology and politics. It was a problem for which Rousseau himself proposed a solution of a purely civil profession of faith in the social contract, which consists solely of sentiments of sociability aimed at fostering citizenship and at reconciling the competing claims of popular sovereignty and the claims of religion. To do so, Rousseau stipulated a separation of belief and conduct, such that the sole gauge of belief in the civil religion would be how one acts. One must believe in the articles of the civil profession of faith, that is to say, one must be sincere, but the only evidence of such belief would be actions in public, beyond which everyone may hold whatever opinions he pleases. The ground for this development of secular citizenship was long prepared, however, by Christianity's introduction of the religion of man, which drove a wedge between being citizen and being human. It divided and expanded the concept of political existence from its natural basis to a partial existence that included alien forces deriving from its being part of a community, all the while promoting the idea of natural right. Rousseau describes this organization of the vocation of humankind in the section on the lawgiver in the social contract, where he writes that, quote, anyone who dares to institute a people must feel capable of changing human nature, of transforming each individual, who by himself is a perfect and solitary whole, into part of a larger whole from which that individual would receive his being. As another reader of Rousseau, Marx, writes on the Jewish question, what Rousseau describes here is the abstract idea of political man, based on the paradoxical idea that one transforms oneself entirely in order to be oneself. This transformation is the alienation that Rousseau recognized could only come from within, and as such on an assurance of sincerity that itself cleaves between what one does and what one believes. As self-alienation, confession thereby abolishes the political character of civil society, reduces the person's distinct activity and situation in life to merely individual significance, and gives to the emancipation of civil society from politics the veneer of a universal content, all the while recognizing the liberty of the individual as mere unrestrained movement within spiritual and material realms, all of which, moreover, is initiated originally by the Christian postulate of the sovereignty of man. Thus, out of this physical, political, theological entanglement emerges at least two remnants. First, the unpolitical man, who inevitably appears as a member of civil society and as the natural man, is, in fact, what one might call the archaic man, whose rights appear as natural rights because his is the world of needs, desires, and labor that the political realm regards as its natural and mythic precondition. And second, this archaic world of civil society is in fact nothing other than a reorganization of life expressing the perfection of the Christian state in its secular and human form, giving any expression of political emancipation, or especially privilege of faith, the paradoxical or even impossible form of mythic immediacy that nevertheless idles on the sidelines of both genuine emancipation and liberty of confession. part 3, final section, the decline of idleness, or the problem of organization in the machine age. In fact, in the final book of the Confessions, we do find a passage where Rousseau devotes to the topic of idleness, of which he registers a historical sea change in the concept. There he writes that the age for romantic plans was past. I had found the incense of vainglory stupefying rather than flattering. So the last hope I had left was to live eternally at leisure. Such is the life of the blessed in the other world, and henceforth I thought of it as my supreme felicity in this. Those who reproach me for my many inconsistencies will not fail to reproach me for this one too. I have said that the idleness of society made it unbearable to me, and here I am seeking for solitude solely in order to give myself up to idleness. The idleness of society is deadly because it is obligatory. The idleness of solitude is delightful because it is free and voluntary. Now, in this passage, Rousseau identifies a difference in the quality of idleness. Free and voluntary idleness can be delightful, but once obliged by society, idleness can be deadly. Benjamin, who cites this passage in a convolute on idleness that he adds to the Arcades project in the late 1930s, suggests that the passage invokes a godlike quality of the idler. The idler idles, as it were, on the sidelines of both politics and civil society, basking in the archaic precondition of modern civil self-alienation, and delighted at the freedom and voluntariness it enjoys as an image of the opposite of said self-alienation. Hence, Benjamin notes, solitude is a condition essential to the idler. But the idler possibly dies if obligated to idle by society, whether as that which does not belong or has lost the possibility for civil political emancipation, or has simply been made redundant from the world and economy of needs, desires, labor, and interests. If society once delighted in the free and voluntary association of individuals idling in distance from one another, free and voluntary partiality of godlike sovereign man, these idlers are also accompanied, if not outright replaced, by other idlers who are only distinguishable from them in virtue of their relative value for life. Across the Arcades project, in fact, Benjamin hints at the irrelevance today of the interior and the unbroken simple nature in Rousseau's sense. In another passage from the Baudelaire Convolutes, Benjamin notes that today the furniture of the interior is broken and confession seems to have been replaced by mystification. It seemed that previously Rousseau could still remark that those who do not leave the interior of their city have little faith. In the interior, there is no need for faith per se, only sincerity, but sincerity no less than the necessary accompaniment to our free and voluntary accession to the general will. In another passage cited from the Confessions, Jean-Jacques comments on an experience he had while working as a secretary for the French envoy to Venice. As soon as word got out that he had abolished the tax on passports, crowds of applicants pretending to be Frenchmen thronged at his office, but, quote, I was not easily fooled, and I doubt whether a single Italian cheated me of my sequin, or a single Frenchman paid it. Rousseau presents it as paramount to know whether or not the applicant is lying in order to prevent tax evasion, even if in practice this is impossible to determine except as a subject before one's conscience. The discernment of free and voluntary accession, however non-contractual, still provides the minimum requirement for association. This situation has changed, however. A bureaucratic machine-driven thinking has replaced the need to know human nature with, quote, practice eliminated from the productive process by machinery. In the process of administration, something analogous occurs with heightened organization. Knowledge of human nature, such as the senior employee could acquire through practice, ceases to be decisive. And this can be seen, Benjamin suggests, quote, when one compares the passage from the Confessions to Joseph Conrad's observations in The Shadow Line, where we read that, quote, I was, in common with the other seamen of the port, merely a subject for official writing, filling up of forms with all the artificial superiority of a man of pen and ink to the men who grapple with realities outside the consecrated walls of official buildings. What ghosts we must have been to him. Mere symbols to juggle with in books and heavy registers, he continues, without brains and muscles and perplexities, something hardly useful and decidedly inferior. Today, it appears, knowledge of human nature has become entirely irrelevant. Sincerity idles by the wayside, as has the organizational form for which it was crucial, the history of the world and of the human species as physical-theological entanglements. Meanwhile, the natural historical form of organization seems to have been replaced by a machinic reorganization of the world of productivity and consumption. In proposing the study of Rousseau's Confessions, Benjamin seems in fact to have wanted to position him as the antipode to Baudelaire in order to make it possible to pose the problem of organization in the machine world. As we read in the Baudelaire convolute, Baudelaire as antipode of Rousseau in the maxim from his essay on romantic art, quote, for no sooner do we take leave of the domain of needs and necessities to enter that of pleasures and luxury, than we see that nature can counsel nothing but crime. In fact, leaving behind the world of needs and necessities, on which the fragile thread of sincerity postulates the coming together of a civil society, the world of machinic organization also replaces its physico-theological human citizen complexes, together with their narratives of perfectibility and confession, and replaces them precisely with their exact counterparts, the creature with the infallible nature, who can be neither sincere nor insincere, and who therefore exists as what Kant would have called mere mechanical being, non-perfectible, incorrigible, and all-permissive. It is, as Baudelaire continues in his essay on romantic art, this infallible Mother Nature who has created parricide and cannibalism. A short step, in fact, separates Baudelaire's insight into the organic link between crime and sheer consumption on the one hand, and the indictment of so-called inferior races for their criminal natures on the other hand, which Benjamin finds in Joseph de Maistre's remarks on the savage, quote, a reflection which was directed against Rousseau. One need only glance at the savage to see the curse written on the external form of his body. A formidable hand weighing on these doomed races wipes out in the two distinctive characteristics of our grandeur, foresight and perfectibility. The savage cuts the tree down to gather the fruit. He unyokes the ox that the missionary has just entrusted to him and cooks it with wood from the plow. Both parricide cannibal and the non-perfectible savage are, in fact, postulates of the same technological promise to alleviate civil society of its enslavement to needs and necessities. In other words, both are postulates of the social obligation to idleness. This socially originated obligation to idle, however, overlooks the fact that in obliging one to liberate oneself of the world of necessity by replacing one's self with a machine, and the point is that this machine with which one is replacing oneself is always presumed to be non-perfectible and all-permissive, regardless of how intelligent it can be. The interest in machines rests precisely on their automative character. One, in fact, reproduces in extremis the very same forms of association that previously produced their counterpart, the archaic natural man of rights. Thus, far from liberating archaic man from nature, the insistence on a reorganization of life by technological mediation for the sake of free time or some other of its iterations only serves to reincarnate and disassemble the human citizen, abstract natural entanglement, into various detritus of social life. That is, as Benjamin suggests, as sheer consumers and racial inferiors. Consumerism and racism, and this is the insight here, are both party to the same logic that produces the mythic image of organized nature, and a state-driven duty to alienate oneself entirely from the world of the interior. This was, finally, the point Benjamin would have elaborated, I believe, in the comparative study of Rousseau and Gide, in which Gide was to have indexed a decline in the social character that issues from sincerity in quotation marks. And it is with some speculations in this direction that I would like to conclude. In all likelihood, Benjamin would have drawn from a text that he had published a few years earlier on Gide. This was a letter, his so-called first Parisian letter, which he wrote in 1936 for the Moscow-based journal Das Wort. No other reason than a biographical fact makes clear that this essay was again at the forefront of Benjamin's mind in 1939 to 1940. It was the discovery of this publication that the Gestapo used as its pretext to strip Benjamin of his German citizenship in early 1939. In this essay, Benjamin had portrayed Gide as the leading intellectual who had confessed his allegiance for communism in his journal. His vehicle was what Benjamin called a fascist attack on Gide's aesthetic principles by the critic Thierry Monnier. In other words, this review of a critique of Gide doubled as what Benjamin envisioned as his essay on the fascist theory of art. And it is explication of this theory, which Benjamin probably intended to retrieve for his comparative study with Rousseau, that I will restrict my remarks. Now, this letter, by the way, is written sort of in between the second and the third versions of the work of art essay. So some of the theses about technology and art overlap, but I'm going to try to sort of bring it to the point where it's actually unique in what it proposes. So according to this first Parisian letter, what makes Monnier a fascist critic of Gide is his assertion that Gide gives up culture to communism. That is, gives up an art of a pure aestheticization for the type of art that was being produced in the polytechnics of the Soviet Union. And in so doing, challenged the boundaries that Monnier saw as inviolable between fabrication and creation. In doing so, Monnier, according to Benjamin, essentially upholds the notion that culture is the domain for the privileged, maintained, moreover, for the privileged, by a violence that restricts art to that which has no production value whatsoever. Art, together with civilization, is regarded as the order of artifice and fiction, conventions and hierarchies that in fact relegate art to a mere mask behind which nothing other than the animal nature of man lurks. Art, in this sense, limited in its functional character to the duping of the uneducated masses, is no longer the edification of the elite. Fascism restricts art to this limited function in order not to provoke a change in the class situation of the proletariat. As such, according to Benjamin here, fascism is deeply art political. It inscribes eternal traits into the existing economy-friendly order in order to make them appear immune to being overcome. And it portrays those in relation to this order as being held in a posture of thrall, which inhibits their capacity to take independent actions. In other words, fascism seeks proximity to the Augenschein, the sheer wide-eyed amazement at things, in order to obscure the functional value of such an appearance. In this, Monnier, according to Benjamin, is close to Marinetti, who saw in this crisis of art a function of technology, specifically the development of the forces of production in such a way that a crisis emerged over their socialization. Marinetti, too, tried to resolve this crisis in a way that made the functional character of technology as unrecognizable as possible, by insisting on aligning art with technology's non-functional value. He proclaims noise, that is, the unproductive activity of the machine, as its most meaningful activity. Monnier likewise identifies the main value of technology to be its poetic value, what he calls a poetic value, its self-value. For him and for fascism, according to Benjamin, the main value of the machine resided not in its instrumental character, but in its unvalorizable, viz. Aesthetic side. To Benjamin, the only art that actually fits this description of art is the art of war, a form of association or organization whose sole mission is precisely to render objects and creatures unusable. Thus, he intuited in Marinetti and Monnier that a futuristic view of the machine might only serve the ends of imperialism. The art of war is the only form of art that embodies the fascist idea of monumental qua non-productive activity of human material, that is, humans as matter, as nothing other than the animal nature of man, as well as the activity of a technology that has been unbound by banal ends. Thus, it is the poetic side of technology, the machine's self-value and unbounded creativity, that is in fact technology's murderous side. It may be worth recalling that the internment camp is one such poetic state of the war machine, socially mandated idleness par excellence. Against the futuristic fictioning of technology, then, it is paramount to insist with Gide on what Benjamin calls the confession of a privilege of interiority, which is to say, not as an insistence on this or any other privilege implied in the theory of art as sheer unusable value, but as a confession to this feeling and description of this privilege as such. To cite from a page from Gide's journal on the 8th of March 1935, quote, "I feel today, seriously, painfully, that inferiority of never having had to earn my bread, of never having had to work to keep body and soul together. A time, however, will come when this will be looked upon as a deficiency." If Baudelaire is described as the lyric poet of high capitalism because his poetry registers in an undistorted fashion an experience that, as Benjamin writes, is complementary to, but only insofar as it shuts out the conditions of its own genesis, namely the alienating, blinding experience of the age of large-scale industrialism, then the Gide-Rousseau complex might have been envisioned as Benjamin's chance to work out an antipode to this, namely in the form of a theory of confessional prose, a mode of writing that in its non-lyricality registers, therefore, in its own domain of interiority, the privilege and functionality of non-true experience in the age of non-high capitalism. In other words, perhaps, the experience of the standardized, denatured life of the civilized masses in the coming communism. Thank you.